In 1934, a farm wife in central Iowa rose at 4 in the morning, fed the wood stove, and by the time her husband and 3 hired men came in from the fields at dusk, she had a supper on the table big enough to fuel another 14-hour day. She did this every single day in killing heat and bitter cold. Number 11 on this list could feed 6 grown men for under $1. Number 4 was so important that hired hands decided whether to stay on a farm based on whether the wife knew how to make it right. Number 1 fed more American farm families than any restaurant ever has, and almost nobody makes it from scratch anymore. These were not fancy meals. They were fuel built by women who understood that a hungry man cannot work. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down. Number 25, fried cornmeal mush. The night before, she boiled cornmeal in salted water until it thickened into a heavy porridge, then poured it into a loaf pan and set it in the cold pantry to firm up overnight. By morning, it had set solid as a brick. She sliced it a half-inch thick, laid the slices in a skillet slicked with bacon grease, and fried them low and slow until each side turned deep, golden, and crisp. The outside crackled. The inside stayed soft and warm. Drizzled with sorghum molasses or a spoon of apple butter, it sat in a working man's stomach for hours. Cornmeal cost almost nothing, a few cents a pound, and a single pan of mush carried a family through breakfast and supper both. It used the cheapest grain in the country and turned it into something a man would ride in early for. Today, nobody waits overnight for mush to set. We forgot you ever could. Number 24, creamed peas and new potatoes. In June, when the first peas came off the vine and the potatoes were still small as marbles, the farm wife made a dish that tasted like the whole growing season in one bowl. She boiled the tiny new potatoes in their skins, shelled fresh peas straight from the garden, and made a simple white sauce from butter, flour, and milk, often milk still warm from the morning's milking. Everything went together into a creamy, gentle stew that she ladled over split biscuits or thick slices of homemade bread. It cost nothing but labor and a little flour because the peas and potatoes came out of the ground behind the house. For 1 week in early summer, it was the finest supper on the farm. Men who spent all day cultivating corn came in and ate 3 helpings. That window was short. When it closed, you waited a whole year. Number 23, salmon croquettes. Most farms were 100 miles from the ocean, so fresh fish was a fantasy. But the general store sold a tall can of pink salmon for around 25 cents, and the farm wife knew exactly what to do with it. She drained the can, picked out the big bones, and mashed the salmon with cracker crumbs, an egg, a little grated onion, and a spoon of mustard. She shaped it into patties and fried them in hot grease until the outsides crisped into a brown crust and the inside stayed moist and pink. Served with creamed peas or stewed tomatoes and a wedge of cornbread, salmon croquettes felt like a meal you would order in town. A single can fed the whole table. Children who swore they hated fish ate 2 without a word. The recipe lived in every church cookbook in America until canned tuna got cheaper and salmon slipped quietly off the supper table. Number 22, skillet hash. Nothing on a farm ever got thrown away, and that included last night's meat. The morning after a roast or a boiled dinner, the farm wife chopped the leftover beef fine, diced cold boiled potatoes and an onion, and pressed the whole mixture flat into a hot cast iron skillet with a good amount of grease. Then she left it alone. The trick was patience, letting the bottom form a dark, crackling crust before flipping it in sections. Some women added a handful of cooked beets, which stained the whole thing a deep red and earned it the name red flannel hash. topped with a fried egg, whose yolk ran down through the potatoes. It was a breakfast that launched men into the fields and held them until noon. It cost nothing because it was built entirely from scraps. We call leftovers waste now. She called them tomorrow's breakfast. Number 21, beef and homemade noodles. This was the dish that turned a tough, cheap cut into a feast. The farm wife simmered a beef roast, or shank, for hours until the meat fell apart and the broth turned rich and dark. While it cooked, she made noodles by hand from flour, eggs, and a little of the broth. She rolled the dough out thin on a floured table, sliced it into ribbons with a knife, and dried the noodles over the back of a chair. She dropped those noodles straight into the boiling beef and broth, where they swelled thick and soaked up every bit of flavor. Often she served the whole thing ladled over a mound of mashed potatoes, starch on starch, because hungry men needed the calories. A little meat fed a lot of people this way. The smell of beef and fresh noodles filled the house by afternoon. Store-bought noodles in a bag killed this dish, and a part of every farm kitchen died with it. Number 20, stuffed bell peppers. This was how 1 pound of ground beef fed 6 men without anyone leaving the table hungry. The farm wife cut the tops off green peppers from the garden, scooped them clean, and filled them with a mixture of browned ground beef, cooked rice, chopped onion, and canned tomatoes. She stood them upright in a baking dish with a little tomato juice in the bottom, covered them, and baked them slow until the peppers went soft and the filling set. The rice doubled the meat for almost nothing. The pepper itself became the bowl, which meant less to wash. Every bite carried meat, grain, and vegetable together. Peppers cost a few cents each, and on a farm, they were free out of the garden. These sat in the center of supper tables across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. They looked like real effort and abundance. They were neither, and that was the genius of them. Number 19, cabbage rolls. In the farm country settled by Poles, Germans, and Slovaks, the cabbage roll fed working families through every hard winter. The farm wife boiled a whole head of cabbage just long enough to soften the leaves, then peeled them off one at a time. Into each leaf went a spoon of ground meat mixed with rice and onion, rolled up tight into a little bundle. She packed the bundles into a deep pot, covered them with tomatoes or sauerkraut, and let them bake slowly for 2 or 3 hours until everything melted together into something tangy and deep and filling. 1 head of cabbage and a pound of meat made enough to feed the family for 2 days. And they tasted even better reheated. The work was in the rolling, dozens of bundles made standing at the table while bread rose nearby. Nobody has that kind of afternoon anymore. The cabbage roll waits in a few old recipe boxes for someone to remember it. Number 18, hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. The farmers called it poor man's steak. The wives just called it supper. She browned ground beef in the cast iron skillet with a diced onion, stirred in a spoon of flour to coat the meat, then poured milk over it slowly until the whole thing bubbled up into a thick, savory white gravy shot through with brown beef. She poured that over a mountain of mashed potatoes, and that was the meal. Ground beef ran around 40 cents a pound. A bag of potatoes cost next to nothing. This fed a whole crew for under $1. The gravy sank into the potatoes so every bite carried both, heavy and rich in the way that only starch and fat can satisfy a man who has been on his feet since dawn. It appeared on tables from Montana ranch kitchens to the dairy farms of Wisconsin. It had no elegant name. It needed none. Number 17, Swiss steak. Cheap, round steak was so tough you could half sole a boot with it, But the farm wife knew how to beat it into submission. She dredged the meat in flour and pounded it with the edge of a heavy plate or a special hammer, driving the flour deep into the fibers, then browned it hard in a skillet. She buried it in onions and canned tomatoes, covered the pan tightly, and let it cook for 2 hours until the toughest cut in the butcher's case turned fork tender and was swimming in its own thick gravy. The acid in the tomatoes broke the meat down while she went out to gather eggs or hang the wash. By the time the men came in, a 40-cent piece of meat tasted like something twice the price. Served over noodles or potatoes, it stretched far. We buy tender cuts now and never learned the patience that made the cheap ones better. Number 16. Smothered pork chops with milk gravy. Every farm that kept hogs had pork, and the farm wife stretched a few chops into a supper for a houseful. She dredged the chops in seasoned flour, browned them in lard until the edges went dark, then set them aside and built a gravy in the same pan from the drippings, more flour and milk. The chops went back in, the lid went on, and they simmered low until the meat fell off the bone, and the gravy thickened into something you wanted to drink from a cup. Poured over mashed potatoes or biscuits, with the pan scraping stirred right in, it was the kind of supper that made a hired man loyal. The milk often came from the family cow, the lard from last fall's hog. Almost the entire meal was raised on the place. Today we grill a chop dry and call it dinner. They knew better. Number 15, liver and onions. Beef liver was one of the most nutritious things a farm family could eat, and after butchering it was practically free. The trouble was that most people ruined it. The farm wife did not. She sliced it thin, dredged it in flour, and laid it in a hot skillet for barely 2 minutes aside. Any longer turned it tough and bitter, and that is why a whole generation grew up hating it. Done right, it was mild and rich, golden outside and faintly pink within. She caramelized a heap of sliced onions in a second pan and piled them on top. Served with mashed potatoes and the pan drippings, it was a complete, deeply nourishing meal that cost almost nothing. Mothers fed it to growing children for the iron, though they never used the word. We stopped eating it the moment we could afford to skip it. The nutrition did not go anywhere. The knowledge did. Number 14, scalloped potatoes and ham. When the Sunday ham was carved down to the last scraps, none of it went to waste. The farm wife sliced potatoes paper thin, layered them in a deep dish with the chopped ham and slivers of onion, dotted each layer with flour and butter, and poured milk over the whole thing until it nearly reached the top. Then it baked, low and slow, for well over an hour, while the kitchen filled with the smell of it. The potatoes drank up the milk and turned creamy, the top browned and bubbled, and the salty ham flavored every bite. 1 cup of leftover meat fed a family of 8. It cost almost nothing because the ham was already paid for and the milk came from the barn. This was Monday supper across the dairy belt for 100 years. The boxed version in the grocery store is a sad ghost of what came out of those ovens. Here is what nobody tells you about these women. The farm wife was not just a cook. She was running a second business with no pay and no day off. She kept the chickens, gathered and sold the eggs, churned the butter, tended an enormous garden, canned hundreds of jars every fall, did the wash by hand, and raised the children, and on top of all of it, she put 3 enormous meals on the table every single day. Dinner at noon was the big one, because that is when the men needed the most fuel. She had no microwave, no refrigerator for years, no recipe she could look up. She cooked from memory and instinct on a wood stove she had to feed and regulate by feel. The food on this list was not simple because she lacked skill. It was simple because she had 11 other jobs and a deadline that came 3 times a day. Number 13, chicken pot pie. Not the little frozen brick from the freezer aisle. The real thing, big enough to feed a threshing crew. A stewing hen, too old to lay and therefore cheap, simmered for hours until the meat fell from the bone and the broth turned golden. The farm wife pulled the meat, thickened the broth into a rich gravy, folded in carrots, peas, and chopped potatoes, and poured the whole steaming mixture into a deep pan lined with homemade crust. She laid a second sheet of crust over the top, cut a few slits for the steam, and baked it until the top turned flaky and brown. 1 old hen and a handful of garden vegetables fed a dozen people. The crust soaked up the gravy underneath until it was almost pudding. Cutting into that golden top and watching the steam rise was a small event in itself. We buy them frozen now and forget anyone ever built one by hand. Number 12, sausage, gravy, and biscuits. Before the men went out at dawn to do the heaviest work of the day, they needed something that would not quit on them by mid-morning. The farm wife crumbled home-ground pork sausage into a skillet, browned it, sprinkled flour over the fat, and poured in milk, stirring until it thickened into a peppery, creamy gravy studded with sausage. She split hot biscuits straight from the oven and drowned them in it. This was not a snack. This was the meal that put a roof of calories over a man's whole morning. The sausage came from the family hog, the milk from the cow, the flour from a 50-pound sack in the pantry. It cost almost nothing and delivered everything a body needs to swing an axe or pitch hay until noon. It has become a trendy brunch plate now, but it was born at 4 in the morning in a farmhouse kitchen. Number 11, Great Northern beans and ham hock. This was arithmetic disguised as supper. The farm wife soaked a bag of dried beans overnight, then dropped them in a pot with a smoked ham hock, an onion, and enough water to cover everything by 2 inches. The pot simmered all day on the back of the stove while she did her other work, the hock giving up every bit of its smoke and gelatin into the broth. By supper, the beans had broken down into something thick and silky, far richer than its ingredients had any right to be. A bag of beans cost a dime. The ham hock was a scrap the butcher nearly gave away. This pot fed 6 grown men for well under $1 and left enough for the next day. Served with cornbread for sopping and raw onion on the side, it built the muscle that worked the American Midwest. Today, we open a can and miss the whole point. Number 10, goulash. Out east, they called it American chop suey, but everywhere in the heartland it was just goulash, and it bore no resemblance to anything Hungarian. The farm wife browned a pound of ground beef with onion, stirred in elbow macaroni, a can or 2 of tomatoes, and enough water to cook the pasta right in the same pot. 20 minutes later, she had a whole skillet of something hot, filling, and beloved by every child at the table. The pasta swelled and soaked up the tomato, the beef gave it body, and the leftovers tasted even better the next day when the noodles had drunk up the sauce. It was the original one-pot dinner, made when the wife had spent the whole afternoon canning and had no energy left for a complicated supper. A pound of meat and a box of macaroni fed everyone. It kept millions of farm families fed under a borrowed name. Here is something the food companies would rather you not think about. Almost every meal on this list was built from ingredients a corporation cannot mark up: dried beans, garden vegetables, a cheap cut of meat, milk from the cow, eggs from the henhouse, flour from a sack. There is no profit in a head of cabbage and no advertising budget behind a ham hock. That is exactly why these meals were quietly replaced. The frozen dinner, the boxed mix, and the canned soup did not show up because they were better. They showed up because somebody could sell them. The farm wife's kitchen was a closed loop that fed a family on what the land produced, and that loop was bad for business. So they sold us convenience, and one generation at a time, we traded away the knowledge of how to feed ourselves from scratch. We did not lose these recipes. They were taken. Number 9, stretched meatloaf. Pure ground beef was too precious to waste on a loaf, so the farm wife stretched it. She mixed 1 pound of beef with 1 cup of oatmeal or torn bread soaked in milk, 1 egg, a grated onion, and a little sage. The oats and bread absorbed the meat juices as it baked, which meant nothing dried out, and 1 pound fed 8 people. She often spread a mixture of ketchup and brown sugar across the top, which baked into a sweet, tangy glaze. A loaf went in the oven in the afternoon and filled the house with the smell of supper by the time the men washed up. The slices held together clean and tasted of meat far beyond what was actually in them. Leftovers became sandwiches the next day. Modern recipes skip the filler and wonder why their meatloaf is a dense, dry brick. The farm wife knew the secret was the cheap part. Number 8, beef stew with dumplings. When the weather turned cold and the men came in soaked and frozen, nothing answered like a pot of stew. The farm wife browned a cheap cut of beef, then added potatoes, carrots, onions, and whatever else the cellar held, and let it bubble for hours until the meat surrendered and the broth turned thick and brown. Then, near the end, she dropped spoonfuls of biscuit dough right on top of the simmering stew, clapped the lid on, and let them steam into pillowy dumplings that soaked the gravy up from below. 1 pot held the whole meal, meat, vegetables, and bread all at once, and it warmed a man from the chest outward. The vegetables came from the garden, the meat from a cut nobody else wanted. It cost little and gave everything. The dumplings were the small luxury that turned survival into something a family looked forward to on a bitter night. Number 7, pot roast. This was the Sunday anchor, the meal the whole week leaned toward. The farm wife took a tough chuck roast, the kind that would chew like leather if you rushed it, browned it hard in the Dutch oven, then surrounded it with onions, carrots, and potatoes, and let it cook low for the better part of a day. Slow heat broke down the connective tissue until the meat pulled apart with a fork, and the vegetables had cooked in the beef juices until they tasted of it. The drippings became gravy. 1 roast fed the family Sunday and reappeared as hash and sandwiches all week. The cheaper the cut, the better it got with time, which is exactly backward from what we believe now. The smell of it carried out to the barn. A man pitching hay all morning knew from a quarter-mile off that pot roast was waiting. We buy expensive tender cuts and have forgotten that patience made the cheap ones king. Number 6, chicken fried steak with cream gravy. The name lies on purpose. There is no chicken in it. The farm wife took the same cheap, tough round steak, pounded it thin, dredged it in seasoned flour, and fried it in hot grease, exactly like fried chicken, until it wore a crackling golden crust. Then she built a cream gravy in the same pan from the drippings, flour, and milk, scraping up every browned bit, and ladled it thick over the top. It turned the worst cut in the butcher's case into the kind of supper a man bragged about. Served with mashed potatoes drowned in the same gravy and a side of green beans, it was a plate that erased a 14-hour day. It cost a fraction of a real steak and tasted to a hungry man like more. It spread from the homesteads of Texas across the whole farm belt. Few home cooks attempt it now, and the diners that still serve it never match the farmhouse version. Number 5. Vegetable beef soup. This was the clean-out-the-garden meal, the one that wasted nothing and tasted different every single time. The farm wife browned a piece of cheap stew meat or a soup bone, then added whatever the garden and cellar offered: carrots going soft, a wilting stalk of celery, an onion, a few potatoes, a jar of home-canned tomatoes, a handful of green beans. It all went in the pot and simmered for hours until the windows fogged and the broth turned deep and savory. Nothing matched from week to week because the soup was a record of whatever was on hand. For pennies, it filled every bowl at the table and used up vegetables that would otherwise have spoiled. A jar of last summer's canning in January tasted like a small miracle. Cornbread on the side caught what the spoon missed. It was thrift and nourishment and resourcefulness in a single pot, and almost no one builds it from scratch anymore. Here is the part nobody likes to say out loud. The farm wife cooked like this because she had no other choice, and she did it anyway, every day, for decades, without applause. There was no thank you at the end of most suppers, just empty plates and men too tired to talk and dishes waiting in the dark. She fed the family, fed the hired hands, fed the threshing crew at harvest, fed the neighbors when somebody died, and she did it on no money and no rest. These meals were acts of love that nobody called love. They were called supper. And when those women passed, most of this knowledge went into the ground with them because it lived in their hands and their memory, not on paper. The recipes that survived did so by luck, scratched in pencil in the margins of a church cookbook by a daughter who happened to write fast enough. Number 4, chicken and dumplings. On a farm, a hired man would judge the whole place by this one dish, and the wives knew it. A stewing hen simmered for 2 hours until the meat fell off the bone and the broth ran golden and rich. Then came the dumplings, and every family fought over which kind was right. The flat rolled kind cut in strips, or the fluffy dropped kind spooned straight into the boiling pot. Either way, they swelled into tender clouds that drank up the chicken flavor from the inside, and the whole pot thickened into something between soup and stew. It was the meal that appeared when a man was sick, when a neighbor was grieving, when the cold set in and nothing else would do. It was care you could eat. One old hen fed a houseful for next to nothing. A farm wife famous for her dumplings never lacked for help at harvest. That reputation was earned one pot at a time. Number 3, soup, beans, and cornbread. In the hill country and across the rural South, this was not a side dish. It was the meal, 4 or 5 nights a week, the bedrock that everything else rested on. The farm wife soaked a pot of pinto beans overnight, then simmered them all day with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock and nothing more than salt and pepper. By supper, the beans had broken down at the edges and thickened the broth into a dark, rich liquor that tasted of the smoke and fat it had cooked with. Cast iron cornbread baked in the oven while the beans finished. You crumbled the cornbread right into the bowl and ate the two together with a spoon. The beans cost a dime a pound. The pork was a butcher's scrap. This single pot built the generations who worked the mines, the mills, and the fields, and they never once asked for anything fancier. Number 2. Fried potatoes and side meat. This is the one we have demoted entirely. Today, fried potatoes are a side, a hash, a thing that sits next to the real food. For millions of farm families, a cast-iron skillet heaped with sliced raw potatoes, fried low and slow in bacon grease, with a sliced onion until the edges went crisp and golden, was the whole supper. Alongside it, she fried side meat, the cheap, salt-cured pork belly that hung in every smokehouse until it was brown and crackling. That was the plate. Maybe a slice of bread to go with it. The potatoes took on the flavor of the fat, the onions melted into sweet ribbons, and the salty meat tied it all together. A 50-pound sack of potatoes cost a few dollars and lasted months. For families who ate this every Wednesday, it was not defeat. It was one of the best things on the table all week. Number 1. Fried chicken with cream gravy. This was the crown of the farm kitchen, the meal that defined a woman's reputation for 30 miles, and the one almost nobody makes from scratch anymore. When the threshing crew came through, or the preacher came to dinner, or it was simply Sunday, the farm wife went out to the yard, caught a young chicken, and did the whole bloody, feathered, unglamorous work herself. She cut it up, dredged the pieces in seasoned flour, and fried them in a deep skillet of hot lard, turning each piece by feel until the crust was shattering golden and the meat ran juicy inside. Then, in that same skillet full of drippings, she made a cream gravy to pour over biscuits and potatoes. A platter of her fried chicken at a harvest table was a thing men remembered for the rest of their lives. It cost almost nothing and meant everything. We pick it up in a paper bucket now, and we have forgotten what it took to earn that smell drifting out a farmhouse window on a Sunday afternoon. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week. Just one. The soup beans, the fried potatoes, the chicken and dumplings, the pot roast that gets better the longer it cooks. Then sit down at a real table and eat it slow. And think about the woman who made it 3 times a day on a wood stove with no thanks coming. Tell me in the comments which one you are going to try, and whether your grandmother made it without ever once opening a cookbook. Because these were never just suppers. They were how a whole country fed the people who fed everyone else.